The MudFlood energetic event hypothesis proposes a solution to the mystery of the worldwide MudFlood event and its alleged cover-up while attempting to answer the journalistic who it happened to, what happened, when, where, why, and how did it happen. What is the MudFlood theory? Proponents of the MudFlood theory compare photographs, maps, and testimonies which suggest that in the late 18th century an unexplained worldwide mud rain event abruptly and permanently raised the ground level around existing cathedrals, pyramids, and other monuments, burying entire civilizations across the earth. Additionally, during this time maps of America and Asia changed significantly. During many worldwide excavations of buried cities, no satisfying explanation is ever given as to how they got buried in the first place. Did foundations sink into the ground as a result of liquefaction? If so, why aren't the buildings tilted, like the Tower of Pisa? A hydraulic drilling catastrophe wouldn't leave mud behind. If the differences in old maps are just cartographic blunders, why are the errors made in such detail, listing ports and islands, plotting rivers and mountains, and somehow failing to spot massive structures like the Grand Canyon or Himalayan mountains? If we consider the possibility that all these events are linked, bigger questions emerge. Where did this mud come from? Where did the energy to transport this mud come from? Was it intentional? What would anyone stand to gain to cover this event up? What else was also covered up, redacted, or erased from history? To be convincing, the MudFlood energetic event hypothesis must reliably explain events of the past. Modern historians stick to the facts as written and do not subscribe to theories of a worldwide mud flood, a great reset, or any kind of historical redaction. However, these theories cannot be ruled out either. Researching any topic related to a worldwide mud flood theory is difficult due to a lack of reliable research material. Virtually all mud flood books, videos, and websites are published by controlled opposition agents. This media typically features deepfake images of buildings that appear to be mud-flooded, yet show no underground buried architecture, and/or were not built prior to the 19th century. These images are designed to be easily debunked and purposefully and perpetually net-boosted. The proliferation of deepfake images is a revelation of the method strategy that promotes discreditation of mud-flood research. Index. After a re-reading of Fomenko's new chronology, I have started revising the MudFlood energetic event, MFEE, hypothesis with the following updates. The MFEE was triggered as a result of the need to defeat the Pugachev rebellion in 1774, and not Napoleon. Therefore, the MudFlood event began in the 18th century, not the 19th. This was the final war between the royal Christian giants who descended directly from Christ and the smaller humans representing apostolic Christianity, ruled by the Romanov dynasty. In the war to stop Pugachev, nearly all the human giants of the earth were eliminated. Hypothesis: the mud flood was caused by energy weapons on Mars. The collection of memories known as the mud flood may have come from a series of catastrophic events that occurred after the Pugachev rebellion of 1773, when strategic positions on the Earth were targeted by large-scale directed energy weapons built by humans inhabiting the planet Mars. This assault targeted Pugachev's army as well as remaining locations still loyal to the memory of the Rus Tartarian Empire. This attack resulted in a significant genocide of life on Earth and allowed the humans on Mars to identify chosen people, who they would deliver to various promised lands, essentially repopulating Earth cities, redacting all Earth history, religion, science, and language, and impose a system of control on the survivors that lasts to this day. By discerning the complete scope of possibilities of a redacted human historical record, by identifying biases inscribed by those who would benefit from bias, then a singular, eclectic world history should emerge, linking events by causality, telling us where we all came from and how things may have led up to the disturbing mud flood event. We start off this investigation with a simple question: why would somebody purposefully redact history? The answer is, the ability to redact the past gives people in the present control of the future. Those who deprive us of the lessons of our past can force us to repeat our mistakes, war, famine, and genocide, benefiting from a predictable outcome that leaves them in charge when the dust settles. Dependent proofs and concepts. A typical conspiracy theory, aka a cancelling hypothesis, will posit the lack of proof supporting a theory as a conspiracy in itself. The mud flood energetic event hypothesis relies on verifiable evidence, even if such evidence is considered debunked by the popular science establishment, who remains unwilling or unable to investigate these topics deductively to this day. A null hypothesis would suggest that any kind of historic mudflood either has no relationship to human history, or could be explained in other ways, or did not happen at all. Deductive logic considers all possibilities, and any phenomena may have multiple possible explanations. For example, a dendritic path carved by water can appear identical to one cut instantly by electricity in the lab. A petrification of a tree or animal that appears to have occurred over millions or billions of years can also be reproduced instantaneously in a lab by a focused high-amplitude electric discharge. Citing the consensus explanation does not debunk the alternate one. Here are a list of suppositions this hypothesis relies on. The phantom time hypothesis by Heribert Illig was published in 1991 and asserted that the Anno Domini dating system was fabricated by Jesuits retroactively adding in a phantom millennium of 1,000 years to the timeline starting in the special year of AD 1053. Numerous authors such as Emanuel Velikovsky and Anatoly Fomenko have academically challenged the chronology of Scaligerian history. Both Catholics like Saint Jerome and Protestants like Joseph Scaliger are accused of opportunistically reappropriating actual African, Asian, and American history into a false European history sometime within the last 500 years. The New Testament was heavily redacted and translated from Cyrillic to Latin. In the 19th century, conversion of the holy texts from Latin alphabet into indigenous languages caused mass illiteracy. Eventually, Reformation historians made the case that Latin was the root of all languages. The redaction of indigenous culture, science, history, medicine, and art into Latin was remembered as the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. Memory's world cataclysms became superstitious myths and religious prophecies. The planet gods were forgotten, replaced by a new media-driven focus on humanism, or as it's known today, communism. The memory of the Rus Horde Tartarian Empire splintered into a false history of the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, Samurai Japan, Manchurian China, Hordean Cossack civilizations of America, Maya, Aztec and Inca and others. But our shared history is so spectacular that it's not easy to invent a fake history to match. As the saying goes, you can't make this stuff up. The 1995 movie The Usual Suspects demonstrates this concept. When covering up a crime, the criminal will change the date of the events, the locations, even the names of the characters, leaving the causality of events intact. The worst crimes of history were pushed into deep antiquity or blamed on something else, like a natural occurrence, or terrorism. The Electric Universe, EU, theory. This theory suggests that plasma physics played a central role in the creation of our solar system, and all solar systems, illustrated by primordial electric scarring seen across the surface of our Moon and Mars. The same types of negative electric scarring also appears in a few locations on Earth, like the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and may have been rendered not so long ago, during the 18th century MudFlood energetic event. The electric universe theory also provides a scientific foundation for the hollow Earth, the young Earth, as well as the expanding Earth models, and effectively retires meteor impact crater theories like the Alvarez hypothesis, ancient dinosaur fossils, and uniformitarian theory at large. Nevertheless, our children are still exposed to one-sided scientific propaganda depicting a dead, chaotic, and meaningless universe, where virtually nothing is possible. EU theory is also the founding explanation for Saturnian cosmology, an alternative to those of uniformitarian, NASA, and creationist models of the universe. In Saturnian cosmology, the planets in our solar system were the gods of old polytheistic religions. They loomed closely in the Earth's sky, clashed with each other, and wrought devastating cataclysms in primordial times, resulting in the encrypted mythical narrative we know today. Human activity on Mars. Martians have been described for centuries by religious authors such as Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who testified to having visited each planet, even inside the Sun, and creationist Emanuel Swedenborg, inventor of uniformitarianism, a century before Hutton, and nebular accretion theory in 1734, both still taught as fact in secular schools today. The famous book Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, categorized as fiction, described details of the Martian moons in 1727, 150 years before they were first discovered by Asaph Hall in 1877. Intelligent activity has been observed in detail by early astronomers like Sir William Herschel, who believed all our planets, including our Sun, were inhabited, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who saw man-made water channels on Mars, and of course Percival Lowell, who in 1895 mapped out the channels using a precision observatory he built in Flagstaff. At that same time, John Jacob Astor IV, 16 years before he faked his own death on the Titanic, published testimony where he visited each planet, and yet again, traveled inside our sun. If these narratives are considered redacted from their original versions and posited as fiction, the possibility emerges of planet Mars as home to a breakaway human civilization which has influenced earthly affairs during the entirety of our shared history. Earth and Mars share thousands of years of recorded history, and during that time it is unlikely that our inner solar system affairs were exploited by any visiting life forms from other solar systems. The Saturnian Golden Age was described as a time of high technology and advanced primordial life, so any visiting aliens wouldn't have stood out back then. Even today, Martians may look considerably different from you and me, may be cold-blooded, having green, scaly, or even mutated skin, but they are still humans, our brothers and sisters. The different appearances from us on Earth are a result of having survived the colder, harsher conditions within Mars and on its surface throughout antiquity. An overabundance of ores like iron, platinum, titanium, palladium, and chromium gave the Martians an early technological start. However, their lack of agrarian and prolific resources drove them to seek subjugation of humans on Earth in order to extract those resources. This subjugation was achieved through the suppression and controlled release of religion and technology throughout history. Advanced communication, free energy, anti-gravity, and advanced weaponry were invented on Mars centuries before they appeared on Earth. World map changes between 18th to 19th centuries. The 1773 Tartarian rebellion was cataclysmic and devastating. Fomenko uses the word wreckage because Pugachev could not be defeated without destroying all the remaining strongholds loyal to the memory of the Russian horde as well. All the Hordean cities of Siberia, Africa, Zealandia, the Middle East, and the Americas were targeted, melted down, and ultimately buried. To locate where these melted cities used to be, simply search Google for a map of gold mines around the world. Before the rebellion, the Siberian Tartarian kingdoms still stood, along with mythical locations, Shangri-La, El Dorado, Lemuria, Zealandia, etc. During the rebellion, Siberia became the wasteland we know today, with all cities melted or buried, and only the Romanov-controlled Moscow remained of the once great empire. There are quite a few world maps dated before the 19th century which differ significantly from later maps. For example, in North America the state of California appeared as an island larger than the United Kingdom. There is no sign of the Grand Canyon, or the 1,400-mile Colorado River. In old maps of Hindustan, the tributaries of the Ganges are significantly different, and there is no sign of the 1,500-mile Himalayan mountain range. Russia released maps from their historical archives of a vast Tartarian empire in Siberia in 2014, in response to a coup in Ukraine. In maps of Tartaria, again there's no Himalayan mountains, Tibetan Plateau, or Great Wall of China. The land was inhabited, decorated with a majestic balance of water, trees, and natural boundaries, nothing like the uninhabitable wasteland we know today as Siberia. The naming of Hollywood. If negative lightning scarring caused the creation of the Grand Canyon, it follows that the same negative energy would behave differently around an island like California than it would in a plain like the Midwest. It is possible that during the MudFlood event the island of California became fused to the mainland of America. If this is what happened, then we can also guess at the inspiration for the name, Hollywood. It might just be that the famous redwood forest was the only forest of its kind, large trees, to survive the event while all other forests were wiped out and in many cases petrified. The island had redirected the secondary energy around its bulk and back out into space, protecting the holy forest. Giants roamed the earth. In America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, the expurgation of our large-scale human brethren is today known as the Smithsonian cover-up. How and why did the giants die? The giant mounds found all over America may not be burial mounds as commonly thought, but instead may be the result of the MudFlood energetic event. During this event, the giants were wiped out by catastrophic electric discharges from the ground and atmosphere. The giants were too large and there was nowhere to hide. As they were struck down, their bones became instantaneously fossilized, and then buried, forming the burial mounds as well as dinosaur fossil sites. Often fossil were found in graveyards or mass mortality sites where a large number of petrified bones have been found, often clustered together, suggesting a catastrophic event that wiped out many individuals at once. Petrification by electricity has been demonstrated in a laboratory by the Sapphire Project. Dinosaur fossils therefore may not be millions of years old, but misidentified giant fossils created recently in the mud flood apocalypse. To the deep state, giants of Earth represented one of the few remaining unconquered races, and an existential threat. Therefore, the wiping out of the giants was not an accident. The Smithsonian Project began in 1846, systematically destroying burial mounds across America, eliminating the evidence of the last civilization. What giant bones could not be covered up were recategorized by the Natural History Museum as ancient dinosaur fossils. As a result of this cover-up, historians have concluded that Native Americans were of average human height and live in tents and caves on Stone Age technology. They further insist that the many incredible Tartarian structures were built not by Americans but by Europeans in the early 19th century, who then abruptly lost the technology to build these structures entirely. A more convincing explanation is that picturesque Tartarian structures were all built by giant humans. Why else would so many of them have giant entrance doors? The red-skinned Native American survivors of the mud flood. The only direct survivors of the mud flood that stuck around afterward were the red-skinned Native Americans. These were the direct relatives of the Lamanites, human giants, who were killed in the mud flood energetic event. The heat of the event turned their skin red. Shortly after, they were hunted to near extinction. Those who capitulated were relocated to Asia across the Bering Strait, Trail of Tears. After the relocation, the Bering Strait was destroyed by the same cannons that destroyed Siberia and America. The deep state is an interplanetary mafia. Whom then are the beneficiaries of global conspiracy? Often in a controlled opposition environment, you'll find amateur conspiracy theorists railing against a particular race, religion, or creed. You'll see conspirator accusations thrown at British, Jews, non-human ETs, dimensional demons, or even the devil. It's important to understand the deep state is loyal to no race, religion, or creed, but rather only to their family. Atlantis represents the first human empire still remembered today. In Saturnian cosmology, it was located on the highest place in the collinear configuration where one could set foot, the north pole of planet Mars. Atlantis was the center of all knowledge in its time. When the collinear configuration, also known as the Tower of Babel, came apart, the Golden Age ended violently. A new dark age of cataclysm would begin, lasting thousands of years. The Atlanteans took the fall hard, and in the desperation to maintain their proto-empire they hid knowledge and technology from the species, burying themselves into the highest levels of human bureaucracy, and establishing a totalitarian world order we today call the deep state. In time, the deep state re-established its empire on Earth by convincing the survivors of the Dark Age that the Saturnian creator of Earth was unhappy and was actively punishing its creation. The priests ordered metal idols crafted of each of the planet gods. They had the idols placed inside pyramids built across the equatorial regions of the globe, and using quantum telepathy, made these idols speak back to the people. What the slaves didn't know was that the idols were not actually deities or planets speaking to them, but humans inside other pyramids on Earth and on Mars. Using this ploy, they indoctrinated more servants into monotheism, luring them with the promise of food, safety, and civilization. The Pyramidal Empire. Remembered as ancient First Rome in the Nile Valley and in the Old Testament as the Egyptian, Babylonian and Persian empires. It existed for over 1,000 years and eventually fell apart when a change in Earth's orbit shifted the equatorial climate of the region, creating the first deserts, eliminating the function of the pyramids and rendering them uninhabitable. As a result, the upper-class elite fled to Central Europe, taking their slave religion with them, and established a second Rome in Istanbul, Turkey. Many black Egyptian slaves stayed behind to preserve the structures of the dissolved Pyramidal Empire and maintain the Egyptian religion, honoring the death of mythical creator god Osiris. A breakaway civilization on Mars is playing God on Earth. At the same time, humans who inhabit Mars became a breakaway civilization, unable to travel to or communicate with the Earth, and cut off from Earth resources. Becoming even more desperate, the Martians reinvented Atlantean technology to survive and eventually drew plans to re-establish their empire on Earth. The invisible influence of the deep state on Mars and elsewhere would become mistaken as the will of a fictional invisible creator of the universe going by the name Yahweh, Elohim meaning creator, mighty and strong, El Shaddai meaning God Almighty, Adonai meaning my Lord, or simply Hashem, which means the name. Playing God allowed the deep state to communicate the will of God through cathedrals, telepaths, prophecy, visions, and even special artifacts. Using its simulated god, the deep state ordered humanity to commit endless religious warfare against itself, dividing civilizations, and always benefiting from the conquest. According to Fomenko's new chronology, the starting date for modern civilization, year 0, was shifted forward in time to the special year of 1053 AD by the Roman Catholic Church. Originally, year 0 marked the end of Earth's formation events and the beginning of modern civilization, stable calendars, travel, and communication. Today, the same Catholic Church hoards these ancient artifacts of our shared history in a 53-mile tunnel underneath Vatican City. Many ancient sites are still buried from the MudFlood. Only in the last 30 years have enough new artifacts been found and made available to the public, allowing us to complete the story that was hidden. Canonization of the holy texts. With the final destruction of all the physical locations of existing world religions, each religion was canonized into the final form we know today. The Latin word canon means both authority and a large gun. This likely means that the authority to canonize the books of the Bible was achieved by the firing of cannons in battle. There is no supernatural influence. We should only subscribe to scientific concepts that can be demonstrated logically, in a laboratory, or otherwise. Real science is reproducible, reliable, and verifiable. For example, Saturnian cosmology relies on the theoretical foundation of the electric universe to correlate religious myths with interplanetary cataclysms seen in proximity to the Earth by humanity. Mythical archetypes like the thunderbolt of the gods were then reproduced by the Sapphire Project in a laboratory. The word God comes from the word good, and devil comes from the word evil, defined as the opposite of anything good. Both good and evil are observed in nature and need no further influence. This hypothesis proposes that the invisible, supreme being, known as God, is actually a human construct invented by the deep state in ancient times, and it benefited that same deep state to keep up the divine charade this whole time. We are ruling out the influence of invisible gods, devils, bug-like, or otherwise repulsive-looking aliens, a galactic federation, simulation theory, fifth dimension, Mandela effect, magic, prophecy, and time travel. Predictive programming in science fiction. The MudFlood energetic event hypothesis relies on the concept of predictive programming as a primer for decrypting truth within media, including controlled opposition media. This theory, sometimes called revelation of method, suggests that deep state agents deliberately leave hints of future events in popular fiction such as books, TV, movies, video games, and news outlets. This is accomplished by the centralization of media, illustrated by Hollywood's domination of the world movie industry, and by categorizing something real as fiction, or something that isn't real, as fact. The goal of this method is to align public opinion with long-term plans of the deep state. Would-be dissenters of these plans then tend to identify themselves early, allowing time for their opinions to be studied and an official counter-narrative cultivated. This eventually leads to the public fighting each other and failing to find the real culprit of their woes. Michael A. Hoffman too states, "The purpose behind the revelation of the method is the implied consent of the populace. If no resistance is raised when they reveal the truth, the cryptocracy is free to continue to follow the satanic precept. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law." In other words, when the cryptocracy reveals their evil manipulations and the majority of the people don't care, it's checkmate. Causality. In journalism, students are taught to answer 6 key questions to allow the reader to approach a topic from various angles. Who, what, where, when, how, and why. Instead of systematically dismissing mountains of testimony from our ancestors, as historians tend to do, let's consider it and allow the high story to tell itself. We owe it to our ancestors and our descendants both to find the answers to these questions. What is the MudFlood energetic event? The MudFlood energetic event hypothesis proposes that the unexplained MudFlood memories collected from around the world starting in late 18th century were caused by a single energetic calamity. This planet-scale energy coursed across the Earth's surface, tearing it up and tossing matter miles into the air, resulting in the destruction and reshaping of land masses and the covering up of cities across the planet with mud. Entire mountain ranges were pulled out of the ground in dendritic patterns by positive electric discharge, while negative discharge tore canyons out of the Earth, identical to the lightning scarring seen across the surface of Mars. The emptied buildings of the reset areas, recently cleared of life, were then repopulated by orphan trains, forming the first cargo cults. Train tracks were promptly built across America, Europe, and Asia, supplying humans and cargo. Similarly, the first insane asylums were constructed across the world, everywhere the tracks led, with the purpose of containing the memory of the Great Reset. Excavations of this buried world continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but instead of revealing the discoveries, they were surreptitiously kept secret, redacted, and even outright lied about. Of all the popular conspiracy theories that exist around the internet, the MudFlood energetic event stands out, opening eyes and blowing minds, and yet no hypothesis has been presented to explain how it happened. Deductively, such an event would have required a substantial release of energy to move trillions of tons of debris many thousands of miles. We have to look for the source, because without the energy, there's no MudFlood. For example, St. Helens in 1980 erupted, releasing 24 megatons of thermal energy, resulting in 3 million cubic meters of volcanic mudflows known as lahars, being transported over 27 kilometers. So, how did the MudFlood event happen? The MudFlood energetic event was caused by an interplanetary assault upon the Earth by humans who inhabit the planet Mars. The method used to achieve this event was the construction of large-scale directed energy weapons, DEW, on Mars fired at Earth during opposition, a planetary alignment. These precision instruments of war devastating sovereign kingdoms, wiping out entire continents and islands. Locations that were not pre-selected for destruction instead experienced heavy mud rains composed of the debris from the targeted regions. As the Mars weapons heated the Earth's surface, the energy built up within the hollow Earth and eventually expelled back through the surface as a secondary negative discharge. This second discharge flowed out of the Earth at points of the least resistance, creating the volcanic regions known as the Ring of Fire, arcing across America and Asia, carving out canyons and melting rock. This secondary discharge may have been unintentional, as it added a significant volume of material to the MudFlood event that covered Eastern America and Western Europe. It also left behind clues too big to be covered up. Trigger: annihilation of the giant humans. The MudFlood energetic event was triggered as a result of the need to defeat the Pugachev rebellion in 1773. The cause for the rebellion itself was the attempts by the Romanov-controlled state to impose taxation and slavery on Cossacks, serfs, and tribal communities. Pugachev was a giant human, as were much of his army. He was also Peter III, descendant of Christ and actual heir to the Russian throne. He was not an impostor, as the Romanov historians say. For this reason, he was leading a rebellion of both giants and smaller-sized humans against the authority of the Romanovs, who had seized control of the empire during the Bloody Oprichnina. Pugachev and other giants were the biggest threat to the Church and its doctrine. The rebellion of Pugachev was the third major war between humans and giants. The first was the Crusade of the early 12th century, see chronology. The second was the Battle of Kulikovo, 1380, where the giants of the Horde succumbed to the marathon cannon technology of the smaller humans. In this battle, royal Christianity was defeated by apostolic Christianity that we know today, canonization. However, in Pugachev's time, giants had their own cannons and were masters of guerrilla warfare. His rebellion was seen as a threat to all the military religious orders of the world, who were just as likely to join Pugachev as to fight against him. This rebellion forced the deep state's hand, requiring a correction of the most extreme nature, a cataclysmic reset of life on Earth. The deep state chose not to reveal itself or its technology in this event, knowing the survivors would defer to the Church's conclusion that the defeat of Pugachev was a divine intervention by an angry creator god. Giants were already hunted and eliminated throughout Europe by the Church, thus this one event eliminated the remaining human giants of the world in a single blow. If any survived, they got the message and left our plane permanently to reside in unknown regions, i.e. Hollow Earth. It's important to also note that the House of Romanov who defeated Pugachev worked overtime to remove themselves from the story, posing the rebellion as a peasant uprising against an alleged impostor, Pugachev, who was posing as Peter III. No surviving records describe under what circumstances the real Pugachev was killed. Fomenko writes, with Suvorov's help, Count P.I. Panin, the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front, defeated the Siberian army of Pugachev. Suvorov personally convoyed the captured Pugachev from Yaik to Simbirsk. He was later brought to Moscow and executed there, after purporting that he was a common Cossack who had rebelled against the rightful rulers, the Romanovs. Most likely, it was in fact some common Cossack who was brought for the execution, but not the real Siberian war chief. It is possible that he was called Pugachev. The true identity of the Siberian leader was probably kept secret by the Romanovs. The two secret panels, which were set up in Kazan and Orenburg in 1773 to 1774, were in charge of the misrepresentation of the Pugachev war history. Where was the MudFlood event? The primary target for this event was the splintered Rus Horde Empire, which the West referred to as the Great Tartary. The primary goal of this maximal damage campaign was to eliminate all temporal resistance to the deep state's plans and prevent a human empire from ever reorganizing on Earth. The secondary goal of the deep state was to preserve the churches and mosques of the Rus Horde Empire, stealing its history, redacting its indigenous Hordean languages into Latin root, splintering its religious icons, and rebranding itself as the Holy Roman Empire. The Rus Horde Empire broke up in 1775 as a result of the defeat of Siberian war chief Pugachev in the Cossack rebellion. Up until that point, Tartarian vassal states spanned every continent. Now these states would fall under the influence of the new deep state. Those who resisted the church edict were eliminated and the descendants enslaved, as promised. The mythical kingdoms of the Pacific Islands were systematically annihilated, electrically machined into lifeless atolls by the Mars weapons. Fortresses as far north as Scotland were annihilated, leaving behind melted ruins. The giants of Western America and Eastern Eurasia were eradicated, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of burial mounds. The weapons carved out land masses like Zealandia, Lemuria, and the Bering Land Bridge, leaving submerged continents. Mesas, never before seen on Earth, formed across Western America, North Africa, and the Middle East. Mountains melted in Australia. Alchemic electrical scarring left painted rainbow canyons in China and Tibet. Many Tartarian cathedrals like in St. Petersburg and Salt Lake City harnessed the electric onslaught and survived. The American west coasts were hit by an uncontrollable secondary negative electric discharge that arced across the continent, leaving behind a snaking electric scar over 1,000 miles long, forming the Colorado River. In the dry desert region, the discharge became so large in amplitude that it tore into the earth, creating the Grand Canyon and the Great Basin. Such dendritic scarring and incredible red rock formations like this are found nowhere else on Earth, yet are seen across the surface of Mars, a planet which experienced intense negative electric discharge in the distant past. Andrew Hall describes how electric discharges sculpted the American Southwest. The land was zapped, carved and seared by electrical storms that could have happened last year, so fresh looked the marks of evidence. As the wreckage from these land masses filled the Earth's atmosphere and moved further away from the targeted zones, this debris cooled and fell to Earth as mud. Western Europe and Eastern America were hit by mud floods. Online today, one can find many pictures of Tartarian buildings in America, Europe, where the Earth level has risen significantly above the first floor with no explanation given. Also, one can find various paintings of an event where reddish mud known as blood rain fell from the sky. The secondary discharge backfired on Mars. It appears that whoever fired the energy weapons at Earth either did not fully understand the risk, or did not care. The direction of the energy through the body of the Earth would be ultimately determined by variations in Earth density. Either way, in a desperate bid to defeat Pugachev, the cannons may have been fired too rapidly, resulting in a secondary discharge as the energy passed through the Earth at the target point, and exited the Earth from a secondary point elsewhere. Mars was in opposition at the time, and thus the energy fired at the Earth would largely return to Mars and cause further damage. Such an event is implied in the dialogue of the Martian intro in the What WPC game. If we study the similarities between science fiction narratives, specifically related to interplanetary war like Ender's Game, Battlefield Earth, Star Wars, Stargate, Scientology, War of the Worlds, etc., we might find a repeating story. A planet attacks another planet, but suffers a catastrophic blowback as a result. Elder 1, the age of disillusionment and decay is over. I have never before witnessed a mass telepathic execution, but today, the remnants of our society have displayed the disheartenment and desperation. They have judged the senior elder to be ineffectual and have terminated his appointment in the harshest manner. The gravity of our situation is extreme. Elder 2, Mars is incapable of sustaining life. Our efforts to maintain the biosphere are exhausted. The water tables and temperature decrease annually, as does our population. Elder 3, the only consequential course of action is the conquest and occupation of Earth, our young sunward neighbor. This predictive programming suggests that life on Mars has not reached exhaustion due to being very ancient, but rather as a result of their planetary ecosystem taking a massive hit during the MudFlood energetic event. Clearly, the majority of Martians did not agree with nor benefit from this attack on Earth. In every version of the story, the instigator of the war, Ender, Turl, Palpatine, Goa'uld System Lord, Xenu, Senior Elder etc., was deposed, exiled and/or executed. When was the MudFlood? Most MudFlood researchers will place the event between the late 18th and early 19th century, when we find an abundance of photos of reset cities, cleared of life, and Tartarian buildings and other monuments buried stories into the ground. This is a good place to look for a geopolitical trigger for the event. In the 16th–17th century, the rebellious reformation of Western Europe began to detach itself, and its military religious orders, from the Tartarian Empire. Thane issued the Requirimiento of 1513, most likely this date was pushed back around 150 years, outlining another plan for world domination, see Rex Bellator 1291 CE, and offering the indigenous people of former Tartarian lands a choice, slavery and annihilation, threatening their families with subjection to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their highnesses. The natives were not threatened by this yet, and tolerated the emergence of Catholics and Protestant colonists on their land up until the middle of the 18th century, when they finally put up a massive rebellion led by Pugachev. The trigger for the rebellion was efforts by the reformist, Catholic, Protestant, Church to impose taxation and slavery upon American lands leading up to the Townsend Acts of 1767 and the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when Mohawk giants tossed 342 chests of tea into the harbor in protest. The Reformation historians then redacted the memory of the Tea Party, eliminating the influence of natives by claiming that instead, colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans. Why did the MudFlood energetic event happen? In 1774, Pugachev's rebellion reached a peak, and claiming to be Peter III and a direct descendant of Christ, Pugachev was in a position to claim rulership of the entire Tartarian Empire and overthrow the foreign house of Romanov that had ruled the empire since the Oprichnina. Had this happened, Pugachev would have been in a position to smash the Western European Reformation, Renaissance that threatened the Tartarian Empire for so long. Had he accomplished that, the Russian Tartarian Empire could have returned to its former glory with a vengeance, reconquering the entire world, and imposing upon it a second Inquisition that would have erased the Reformation, Renaissance and monotheism, and along with them, slavery, usury, and everything else in Pandora's box. The Protestant Reformation that was planning to erase the Russian Empire was sponsored largely by humans on Mars over the course of history, with Martian agents appearing as angels in cathodic telepathic visions. These same influences on Mars would not suffer, seeing all their plans and efforts over hundreds of years destroyed as a result of the rebellion, and took desperate measures to reverse Pugachev's accomplishments and preserve the Renaissance. They built and fired one or more massive energy cannons built on Mars, targeting each city liberated by Pugachev. By the end of the war in 1775, all of Siberia, the once great Tartarian kingdom, remained a wasteland, with all of its mythical locations melted and/or buried. Who caused the MudFlood? The only entity capable of causing such destruction was the advanced human civilization living on Mars, which had broken away after the Golden Age. Until the War of 1773, human Martians had used cathodal churches and telepathy to play God on Earth, perform espionage, and speak to religious leaders through visions of angels. Through simple tricks, they managed to consolidate nearly all religious military orders of the Earth via treaties like Rex Bellator. The only demographic they could not consolidate were the human giants, partially because they were difficult to defeat in battle, and partially because they historically rejected monotheism. The entity known as the Deep State is as old as humanity itself and is located in all the secret places of the Earth, as well as places we were told humans cannot live, like on planet Mars. In the desperation to stop Pugachev, they employed the use of large-scale directed energy weapons on Mars that would become the instrument that reversed the victories of the rebellion, annihilating his army along with the infrastructure of the Russian Hordian Empire and its allies. Starting in 1774, the Mars weapons eliminated all threats to the Deep State on Earth and set the stage for a reset of history. By doing it this way, the Deep State covered up its own involvement while striking the fear of God into the survivors, who had little choice but to accept the Church's conclusion that Pugachev's defeat was divine retribution by God for insubordination. During the 40-plus years of the MudFlood event, much of the Earth became an unlivable desert. Many ecosystems in places like the Middle East, North Africa, Australia etc. never recovered and remain deserts. If the deep state caused the mud flood event, then they were in a unique position to become the saviors of humanity as life on Earth began to die at increasing rates. Playing God, the deep state chose a new set of Israelites to survive the apocalypse. These chosen humans were kept alive via cargo, or manna, from a mysterious supplier that posed itself as the creator God of the universe. Eventually, this same God offers the Israelites a slave contract known as the Mosaic Covenant or 10 Commandments, and promises if they live by the contract, that they will be delivered to a promised land. So, after surviving the 40-plus years wandering the mud-flooded desert, agents of the deep state deliver each Israelite group to the relative, promised land, as promised. Those Israelites who disobeyed God's command quickly perished, either denied cargo and starved, or were slaughtered by their peers in an attempt to appease God's wrath. Events of the mud flood were then further redacted into the Old Testament Exodus narrative, converted to indigenous languages and redistributed in the 19th century. 1776 CE, the Greatest Reset. With the defeat of Pugachev came another Great Reset and a return of monotheistic deep state rulership enshrined in the Declaration of Independence 1776. The inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes and conditions. By painting the Native Americans as enemies of the new republic, the founders of the United States of America would unleash upon the New World everything the natives fought and died to prevent: slavery and debt prisons, usury and taxes, secret societies, bloodline aristocracies, forced mass worship and labor. Pledges of allegiance, false flag terrorism, endless wars, genocide and population control, planned obsolescence, famine, and scarcity. The declaration never mentioned the Tartarian Empire, much of which had already been physically destroyed. All ties to the old empire were inherited and redacted by agents of the Western European Reformation, i.e. Renaissance. The memory of the once great world empire that stood for stability, peace, and abundance for centuries was erased. All subjects of this former empire became savage Indians, targeted for elimination by European colonists. A brutal form of slavery involving chains and whips, prisons and hard labor, became prevalent. Pandora's box was opened once again. Fact becomes fiction and vice versa. The deep state knew that if they exposed their technology to reverse the achievements of the Pugachev rebellion, it would be only a matter of time until their clandestine rulership would be exposed and then lost completely. To reassert control of the religions of Earth, while continuing to hide their existence, they needed everyone to be convinced that Pugachev and his allies were wicked and eventually defeated by God. The deep state would continue covering up its tracks by reclassifying all threatening literature as fantasy or science fiction. All references to advanced technology or life on Mars would become suppressed, unless it was categorized as fiction. Those who resisted the reset disappeared into new or converted insane asylums across the planet. In North America, former libraries and churches were refashioned into large-scale asylums where ABD maintained in Baltimore, New Orleans, Madison, NJ, and New York, and run by the government with a heavy church involvement. Sometimes the asylums were built and maintained directly by the regional church, like the York Retreat run by Quakers. Under the guise of mental health, patients who remembered the pre-mud flood world were referred to as lunatics, sequestered, tortured, left to rot to death in small cells. The mysterious carbon-14 spike in 1063 BCE. The 774 to 775 carbon-14 spike is an observed increase of around 1.2% in the concentration of the radioactive carbon-14 isotope in tree rings dated to 774 or 775 CE, which is about 20 times higher than the normal year-to-year variation of radiocarbon in the atmosphere. Based on the tree ring date of 774 CE, the actual date would be 1154 phantom time discrepancy, 774 by Scaligerian dating, equals 379. 379 plus, my estimate for end of cataclysm date 684 BCE, equals 1063 BCE. Therefore at some time during the end of the cataclysmic Dark Age, a mass casualty event may have occurred on Earth and Mars that dumped an excess of carbon into the atmosphere which got absorbed by trees. The event appears to have been global, with the same carbon-14 signal found in tree rings from Germany, Russia, the United States, Finland, and New Zealand. Researchers went looking in the wrong year for a known event that could possibly explain this increases and found this quote from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Annus Domini, the year of the Lord, 774. This year the Northumbrians banished their king, Alred, from York at Eastertide, and chose Ethelred, the son of Mull, for their lord, who reigned 4 winters. This year also appeared in the heavens a red crucifix. After sunset, the Mercians and the men of Kent fought at Otford, and wonderful serpents were seen in the land of the South Saxons. Adding the year of our Lord to 774, we get 1774, the same date as the rebellion of Pugachev that led directly to the MudFlood event. Was this red crucifix in the night sky a sign of the weapon that was being fired from Mars? Results and null hypothesis. The MudFlood energetic event hypothesis is rejected if it is unable to solve the mystery of the MudFlood without creating new uncertainties and contradictions. It must explain, for example, why so many cities are buried, and sometimes melted, and why the event appeared to happen recently in the last few centuries. It must also explain why the event was covered up, and who benefited. It must also predict later events, like the continued genocide and subjugation of the indigenous people worldwide, the sudden emergence of the British Empire in the 19th century, and the changing of world maps. The hypothesis is rejected if the MudFlood was caused by something other than humans on Mars, like non-human aliens or a natural disaster, or occurred earlier than 1773. It is also rejected if any of the dependent proofs and concepts are rejected, for example, if Fomenko's new chronology turns out to be wrong. Conclusion. The MudFlood energetic event, MFEE, hypothesis posits that a large-scale interplanetary energy attack triggered a catastrophic mudflood and planetary surface reshaping on Earth in the late 18th century, starting around 1774, culminating in a complete historical and societal reset. The hypothesis attempts to solve such 20th-century mysteries as the excavation of buried, melted, or mud-flooded cities, the unexplained changes of world maps, our inability to reach Mars, strange CERN rituals, repeating predictive programming themes in science fiction, the creation of the deep state, the disappearance of the human giants, and many others. The Earth history timeline reconstruction provides a geopolitical foundation for explaining why the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 may have been so significant to world affairs, and why it may have triggered an apocalyptic interplanetary genocide.